But I'm curious.
This is a basic point that, and it's a basic lesson of all of history, is that advantages of any one place are temporary. They could be temporary over the course of centuries, or they could be fleeting over the course of decades, depending on what you're really looking at. But technology, which is usually the key to giving some kind of advantage, military technology or productive technology, and in the case of the 19th century, I put the steam engine as absolutely central to that unique advantage of Europe over the rest of the world. It wasn't the only advantage, but it was very key. Eventually, good ideas, technology, know-how diffuse. And so keeping a monopoly of power is almost never possible. You can try to hold trade secrets. You can try to limit the exports of high technology, but reverse engineering, copying success stories, understanding the underlying science and technology, this is a worldwide gift. And so leaders find competitors because the basis of that leadership was typically some kind of real substantive technological advantage, very often a military advantage that had come, but then one that was quickly copied elsewhere. Of course, the whole nuclear age was like that when the atomic bomb was developed at Los Alamos and then dropped as a demonstration by Truman, a demonstration to Stalin by killing massive numbers in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The U.S. planners thought that the U.S. would have the atomic monopoly probably for about 30 years. It lasted 4 years because the Soviets spied, because they had great scientists, because of a lot of things. But monopolies don't last. The idea that the United States has choke points is a constant meme. It's almost ludicrous, but you go back to the beginning of 2022, the U.S. talked about cutting off Russian banks from SWIFT as the nuclear option. It was going to bring down the Russian economy. We had the choke points. We had the definitive hold on power. It basically meant almost nothing in the end. So this is a constant refrain of history that if one country takes the lead, which Britain did in industrialization at the late 19th century, and then especially after the Napoleonic Wars, other countries innovate, catch up, steal good ideas, narrow the gap, and often leapfrog. And that was true of both Britain, of Germany and the United States vis-a-vis Britain in around 1870 onward. And this is, but it was kept within the Western family, I would say, broadly speaking, for a long time. It led to many racist ideas that this is a white people's hegemony, that this is a European cultural hegemony, that this is a Christian hegemony. But the idea was that, yes, even as the reach of technology spreads, with Germany and the U.S., it's somehow all within the broader family. It's the Western dominance. One country, and one country only, joined that by the end of the 19th century, and that was Japan. And Japan began its own imperial adventures on the basis of imitating the European empires. And very cruelly, Japan invaded China multiple times and other parts of Asia in imitation, I would say, of the European empires. But other than Japan, this was a Western white Christian hegemony over the rest of the world. And it was taken by and large to be a permanent feature. There were glimmers of insight that this was temporary. Napoleon supposedly warned that when China awakes, the world will tremble. He supposedly said that I think in exile already in the 1810s. But the point is that the natural dominance of the West was assumed. It became very deeply part of the mindset of the U.S. and Europe. After World War II, Europe accepted that the U.S. would carry the lead baton, but still the assumption of Western dominance prevailed. And I'd say it still prevails till today in some mindset change. China is viewed as an absolutely improper intrusion, as something that can be contained, as something that needs to be contained. How did we let that happen? Our biggest mistake was we let China into WTO, is a constant refrain in Washington. We let them develop as if that's the American choice. But that's also part of this delusion that the natural order of things is the Western dominance. In any event, I think that's over. That's the point.
Well, in realist theory, though, it's often assumed that states are security maximizers. That is, if we're unbalanced, we'll continue to expand. So NATO expansion, Middle East, all of this, until we're balanced. Once we're balanced, then we'll seek a new status quo in order to essentially maximize our own security. And you would think that as NATO expansion came to a grinding halt in Ukraine, as NATO has been balanced by Russia, or what we see now with the Middle East, or what we see with China, you would assume that there would be a diplomatic effort to shift to a new status quo. Do you see it? But I don't see it essentially. Instead, if I look at Iran, I think this is part of the reason why there can't be a peace, because Trump only wants a hegemonic peace. And we saw that the US was quite desperate for a ceasefire. They agreed to Iran's format, then walked it all back once the guns went silent. And now the US appears to be marching toward all-out war against Iran. Is this based on their reluctance to, find a peace that's not based on dominance, or what do you think Trump's play is?
This is a great question, and I think it comes to the varying schools of thought of realism. There is the school of thought of our good friend John Mearsheimer, offensive realism, which says that you can't really find an equilibrium among the great powers. They're always looking for an advantage. They're always annoying each other. And in John's theory, you end up with what his great book is titled, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. John says, no, there really can't be a balance of power that's satisfactory. In what is sometimes in U.S. schools called defensive realism rather than offensive realism, the idea that security is at the center, but you can find a kind of modus vivendi of the great powers and a bit stay out of each other's way, and treaties can matter and stabilize things to a bit, is the predominant view. I would say Kissinger was somewhere in between the two. Strangely, Kissinger studied the concert of Europe. This was his great model, the 19th century relative stability of the major powers of Europe through a concert of systematic negotiation and basic norms of behavior. But Kissinger also succumbed to the offensive realism that when the other side is down, take advantage of it. So he was in favor of NATO enlargement in the 1990s, even though he knew it would provoke Russian unhappiness. And others argue for that prudence is feasible. I think what one of the things that makes John Mearsheimer's work so important is that while I don't agree with it myself as the necessary description of international politics, I think it's not let me put it positively, I think it's a very good description of the mindset of American strategists. So American strategists don't take enough as a basis for stopping. There is a problem in the United States, which is if any other major powers are standing, we are threatened, is the idea. And so the United States has and by U.S., of course, I mean Washington, and by Washington, I mean mainly the security establishment, has a very hard time with the idea that Russia is a stable, great power. It has an extremely hard time with the idea that China is a stable, great power. It's going to have a hard time with India being a great power because in the American mindset, and I think it is, I don't want to overinterpret John Mearsheimer's thoughts, but I think he does portray right the idea that it's too dangerous just to leave these other powers. You can't really trust them, and you should do what you can to undermine them. So John does generally view China as a threat that we should be doing what we can to contain. I disagree with that viewpoint, actually, rather deeply, because I don't view China as a threat to the United States at all. And so I would like to work on cooperative accommodation in a number of ways and stay out of each other's red lines and stop the United States stopping from arming Taiwan and many other things that I think would make the world a lot safer. But the American mindset is it's a dangerous world out there and we have to push wherever we can. And we have caricatures of that. Our most caricaturish senator, who is a warmonger for every occasion. If you want a new war, you trot him out, is Lindsey Graham. He's always saying, we need more war. Don't stop. Escalate. Whatever it is, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's Taiwan, whether it's Iran. And there is a course like that. One theory is they get campaign contributions from military contractors, and so they're mouthpieces for them. They're warmongers in other ways. But there's also an idea that America should be the unipolar power, and that it should fight its way to do that if necessary. And it should put a stick in the spokes of any other major power to tie that power up in knots. And create trouble for it. And that, to my mind, is an accurate description of American foreign policy making and statecraft, but also a disastrous approach that is unnecessary, destabilizing, and ultimately dangerous for the United States itself, not to speak of all of the rest of the world.
Well, when there's extreme power disparities or over the past centuries of Western dominance, it makes often sense for it to generate or be accompanied by ideologies of superiority. So when you address the rise of the rest, as you say, or the rise of China, the reaction one often gets would be, I guess, encapsulated in work like Robert Kagan. He wrote the book The Jungle Grows Back, America and Our Imperiled World, in which essentially the answer is the garden, which would be us, the civilized us, would have to go out and trim back the jungle again and civilize it. I mean, this is a
very deep ideology. It goes back centuries. It's also very interesting from the point of view of the history of thought. Philosophers inadvertently or inadvertently often really are just the scribes of power. And so when countries become powerful, the philosophy arises to underpin that power. And we had centuries of European ascendance and then 150 to 200 years of unchallenged European dominance over the rest of the world. Basically, while Europe lost some battles, it won most of the wars in Africa and in Asia. And a whole ideology developed, many variants of it, scientific racism, pseudoscientific racism, I should say, but scientific racism, and of course, the religious impulse, God's on our side, and many other similar philosophical ideas, the civilizing mission, we have the key to civilization, and even the most enlightened, subtle, impressive thinkers like John Stuart Mill were basically imperialists. John Stuart Mill worked for the East India Company. He wrote tracts for it, and he wrote that it's Britain's mission to bring civilization to backward India. And so it's okay if there's a tutelage period. This is what empire is for. So a lot of ideology developed, and it goes away very, very slowly. You look at British and French behavior, while they don't have empires anymore, they absolutely have imperial mentalities. And often even more naive and militaristic than the United States, which actually has an empire. But British Russophobia and Britain's drumbeats of war against Russia in Ukraine they're even louder than in the United States and cruder and more simple-minded. But they come from a longer period of empire. The idea that British dominance is natural, inevitable, that Russia was the enemy of British dominance, and they still continue that battle, even though they're an island, not an empire. And it would be humorous if it weren't so dangerous.
Well, in the 19th century, John Stuart Mill advocated for a liberal empire. Today, we have NATO advocating for liberal hegemony. So there's some consistency in history, though. But
I say we learned everything we know from the British Empire, everything America thinks it knows from the British Empire. And actually, the links are very direct. Of course, language, culture, direct education. It's all there. To be seen. And if Bill Clinton was a Rhodes Scholar and Rhodes was the great imperialist of Africa, great in the large at the beginning of the 20th century, Clinton sucked that up at Oxford so that when he became president of the United States in the 1990s, he was filled with American grandiosity that he had somehow learned from the British experience.